A storm was sweeping through Snow Ridge when a tired officer and his little girl spotted something barely moving in the snow. Not a person, not a shadow, but a wounded German shepherd, eyes filled with something deeper than pain, something like hope, waiting to be seen. They didn't know it then, but this broken stray would become the soul of their home, and the bridge between a grieving man, a lonely child, and the kind of love that doesn't ask where you've been, only if you'll stay. What happened next will stay with you long after the video ends. But before we begin, tell me, where are you watching from? Drop your country in the comments. And if you believe that even the most broken heart, whether human or animal, deserves a second chance, hit that subscribe button. Because this isn't just a story about a dog, it's a story about finding your way home, when all you've known is loss. The town of Snow Ridge, tucked into the folds of the northern Montana mountains, was blanketed in silence. Snow fell in thick, slow spirals, settling over pine branches like layers of forgotten time. The storm had been steady since early afternoon, painting the world in shades of white and gray, muffling even the whisper of the wind. It was the kind of cold that didn't ask permission. It took your breath, your memory, and if you weren't careful, your way back home. Jack Monroe drove slowly along the narrow county road that twisted between the tree lines, the headlights of his patrol SUV casting long cones of light through the snowfall. Jack, 38, was a man worn not by age, but by the quiet weight of grief. Tall and broad-shouldered, with sandy brown hair cropped close and a lined jaw that rarely cracked a smile, he wore the uniform of a sheriff but carried the silence of a widower. 3 years had passed since his wife died in an accident that turned him from officer to single father. Since then, he had moved them from the noise of Helena to the stillness of Snow Ridge, searching for something gentler, something safe. In the passenger seat, his 9-year-old daughter Clara sat curled beneath a wool blanket, her breath fogging the window beside her. Clara had her mother's eyes, gray, thoughtful, rimmed with long lashes that made her look like she was always in the middle of a prayer. Petite and pale, she wore her hair in 2 loose braids, the ends tied with faded pink ribbon. Clara didn't talk much, not since the accident. She did, however, pray every night. For her dad, for the old dog they used to have, and lately for a friend who wouldn't leave. Jack had just finished a long shift and picked Clara up from her after-school program at the church. As they crested a low ridge near the edge of the forest, Clara stirred. "Dad," she said, sitting up, her voice light but alert. "There's something... there." Jack slowed the vehicle. Ahead, something dark slumped against the snowbank in a regular shape, barely visible in the swirl. He pulled over, flicked on the hazard lights, and stepped out into the cold. The snow hit his face like a slap. Clara opened her door before he could stop her, but he held up a hand. "Stay behind me," he said, voice firm but gentle. They approached together, footsteps crunching. The shape didn't move. Jack squinted. It was a dog. Large, covered in mud and patches of frozen blood, the animal lay half-curled, one back leg stiff at an unnatural angle. Its coat, mostly black with soot-gray streaks, was matted with ice. As Jack moved closer, its eyes opened, and locked with his. Not wild, not afraid, just tired. "It's a shepherd," Jack muttered. German, maybe 4 or 5 years old. Clara crouched beside him. The dog's ears twitched but didn't flatten. It let out a low, choked whimper. "Dad," Clara whispered. "He's hurt." Jack hesitated. Snow was piling on the dog's body like the earth was trying to bury it alive. The sheriff's instinct told him to call animal control. But Clara reached out slowly, deliberately, and laid her mittened hand on the dog's soot-crusted head. The dog didn't growl, didn't flinch, just blinked, then let out a long breath that steamed in the cold. Jack sighed. "We'll take him back, just for the night." Clara's eyes lit up. "Thank you." He retrieved a spare blanket from the car, wrapped it around the animal, and together they lifted it gently into the back seat. The dog didn't resist, though it winced when Jack adjusted its leg. Back on the road, the heater at full blast, Clara leaned back and watched the dog. "What's his name?" she asked softly. "He doesn't have one." Jack replied, glancing in the mirror. "He looks like Ash," she said. "Like he walked out of a fire." Jack nodded slowly. Ash, then. And so it was. Ash. That night, they laid Ash on an old quilt near the fireplace. Jack cleaned the wound as best he could, while Clara fetched warm water and towels. The leg wasn't broken, but the cut along the thigh was deep. Jack stitched it with a steady hand the way he had once learned in academy first aid. Ash remained silent through it all. Only his eyes moved, watching Clara as she sat beside him, brushing debris gently from his ears. Later, after Clara had gone to bed, Jack stood in the doorway and looked back at the living room. The fire crackled low. Ash was curled near the hearth, his breathing shallow but even. Something shifted in the room. Not physically, but emotionally. A presence. The silence Jack had lived with since his wife died didn't feel quite so suffocating anymore. It felt shared. Not healed, but shared. Morning light filtered through the frost-smeared windows of the Monroe cabin. Outside, the storm had passed, but the snow remained, piled thick against fences and tree trunks. The world was silent except for the occasional creak of branches heavy with ice. Inside, Jack stood in the kitchen pouring coffee into a chipped enamel mug, his eyes drifting to the living room where Ash lay curled up near the now cold fireplace. The dog had barely moved all night, save for when Clara got up once to check on him. She had tiptoed into the living room, knelt beside him, and whispered something Jack couldn't hear. Ash had opened one eye and exhaled a soft sigh, letting her tuck a blanket around his torso. But when Jack tried to approach, Ash's ears flattened, and he let out a quiet, warning growl. Not aggressive, just wary. Jack sighed and sipped his coffee. He hadn't planned on keeping the dog. They didn't need another mouth to feed or more trouble than they already had. He'd call the shelter in a day or two, let the professionals take over. That was the logical thing to do. He was a sheriff after all. He couldn't afford attachments that could get messy. But logic didn't explain the way Clara had smiled last night for the first time in months. Later that morning, Clara came down the stairs in thick socks and an oversized green hoodie that had once belonged to her mother. Her cheeks were rosy from sleep, and her braids had come half undone. She knelt by Ash again, brushing away a few new flakes of ash-like dirt from his coat. "He's still warm," she whispered. "That's good, right?" Jack nodded from the kitchen but didn't speak. Clara looked back at him. "He didn't bite me." "He won't," Jack said gruffly, though his tone lacked conviction. Around mid-morning, a sharp knock echoed at the front door. Jack opened it to find a familiar figure standing on the porch. Mrs. Melba Cranston Mell, to everyone, was one of the few remaining original residents of Snow Ridge. A sprightly widow in her 70s with a voice like dry leaves rustling in wind and a fashion sense that hadn't changed since 1965, she was wrapped in a lavender coat with faux fur trim and wore snow boots 2 sizes too big. Mel peered into the house with narrowed eyes. "Heard you brought home a stray," she said, brushing past him before he could answer. Her breath smelled faintly of peppermint and menthol rub. "Where is it?" Jack sighed. "Good morning, Mel." "Don't sass me, Jack Monroe," she said. "You know how folks talk. You take in a wounded dog off the road, people assume things. Dangerous things." Clara appeared behind her father, clinging to his shirt. Mel's gaze softened slightly. "Morning, sweet pea," she said with a smile that barely creased her sharp cheeks. "He's not dangerous," Clara said quietly. "He's just tired." Mel looked at Jack again. "You should report it. Have you checked if he's chipped?" "I plan to," Jack said. Mel didn't press further, but as she turned toward the door, she casually lifted her phone and snapped a photo of Ash without asking. "Just in case someone's looking for him," she muttered. Jack didn't stop her, but he didn't like it either. After she left, Clara looked up at her dad. "Do you think someone bad is looking for Ash?" He didn't answer, not yet. That night, Clara dragged a worn pillow and an old flannel blanket into her room and carefully laid them beside her bed. Ash watched her from the hallway, head low, tail still. "It's okay," she said gently, patting the spot. "You can stay if you want." Ash didn't move. So Clara sat on the floor and waited. Minutes passed. Then, finally, with a slow limp, Ash padded into the room. He didn't lie on the blanket. He lay beside it, close enough to feel its warmth, but not to use it. Clara fell asleep, smiling. The snow in Snow Ridge had begun to melt, revealing the deep brown earth beneath, but the cold lingered in the bones of the town like an echo that wouldn't fade. At the Monroe home, the days felt longer now. Clara had begun waking up earlier just to check on Ash. She spoke to him as she braided her hair or poured cereal, and though the dog didn't speak, his eyes followed her like he understood every word. Ash, still limping slightly, had begun to move with purpose. During the day, he remained quiet and close to the fire, occasionally stretching out near the back door. At night, however, his demeanor shifted. He patrolled the cabin's perimeter, ears pricked, nose to the ground, as if remembering something from a past life. Jack noticed, and he didn't like it. 3 days after Mel's visit, Jack received a knock on the station door. It was a small, square building at the edge of Main Street, sandwiched between the post office and a coffee shop run by a moody barista named Lane. Lane was in his 20s, tall and wiry, with gauged ears and a deep dislike for small talk. That morning, he waved Jack over with a strange look on his face. "Someone posted about your dog," he said, holding up his phone. "Went a bit viral. Got shared in a missing pet group, and now it's all over the regional forums." Jack took the phone. A blurry picture of Ash, clearly taken from Mel's post, was now captioned. "Found German Shepherd near Snow Ridge. Does he belong to you?" Beneath it, over 200 comments. Some were from people looking for their lost dogs. Most weren't a match wrong coat, wrong location, wrong age. But 2 were more insistent. That afternoon, the first visitor arrived. A young woman named Cassidy, in her early 30s, with thick glasses and a flowy poncho that fluttered dramatically with every step. She claimed Ash was her dog, Rusty, who had gone missing a year ago. But when Jack brought Ash out, the dog showed no sign of recognition. No tail wag, no ear perk, only a cold stare and a subtle growl. Cassidy left flustered, muttering something about ungrateful mutts. The second came the next day. A man tall, with a stocky build, deep-set eyes, and a thin scar that traced his jawline like a question unanswered. He drove a black pickup with out-of-state plates and introduced himself as Mr. Ross. He claimed the dog was a retired guard animal, trained for protection. His voice was calm, but his stare lingered too long on Clara, who stood by the doorway. Ash had been lying down when Ross entered, but the moment the man stepped inside, Ash stood, tense and rigid, a low growl vibrating in his chest. Jack stepped between them immediately. "He doesn't seem to like you," he said flatly. Ross shrugged. "He's been through trauma. Dogs forget people sometimes." "No," Clara said, stepping beside her father, eyes wide but firm. "Ash remembers." Ross's jaw tightened. He left without another word, but something about his walk too steady, too rehearsed, put Jack on edge. That night, he dug through a drawer in the hallway and pulled out an old security camera kit he'd never installed. He stayed up past midnight wiring the system to the front and back porches. Ash didn't sleep. He paced the house. 3 days later, Clara was in the backyard making snow angels in the last patches of unmelted snow when Ash stopped suddenly, ears alert. He turned to the edge of the fence, nose twitching, then barked deep, deliberate, focused. Clara followed his gaze and noticed something she hadn't seen before. Footprints. Not theirs, not Jack's boots, and not small enough to be from kids. She ran inside, breath visible in the air. "Dad!" she called. "There's someone out there!" Jack came out with his coat half-buttoned, flashlight in hand. Ash had already pressed his nose to the fence line. The prints were fresh deep enough to show heel shape, but fading at the edges as if someone had moved fast. They led to the road and stopped. That night, Jack reviewed the footage. Nothing, but just before dawn, a motion alert blinked on his phone. He rewound the footage and saw it. A dark figure standing still at the edge of the woods, not entering the property, just watching, then gone. All that remained were faint tracks, and when Jack went outside, the only clue left behind was a set of tire marks veering back toward the highway. Ash had already sensed it hours before. Jack Monroe sat at the kitchen table, flipping through an old manila folder that smelled faintly of burnt coffee and damp paper. Clara was outside building another snow fortress for her imaginary kingdom, and Ash ever watchful sat nearby like a loyal sentinel. The dog's golden-brown eyes tracked her every move, even if his body stayed still. The incident with the man named Ross hadn't left Jack's mind. Something about that encounter had scraped at the back of his memory like a blade against rust. Jack wasn't just a sheriff of a small town. Before Snow Ridge, he had worked narcotics for the Missoula Police Department. Years of dealing with traffickers had sharpened his instincts, and Ross had tripped every wire. The man's two steady eyes, the false familiarity, the way Ash had reacted. So Jack went digging. That morning, he'd called a friend and Missoula PD Detective Paul Granger, a barrel-chested man in his 40s with a bristled beard and a voice that always sounded like it was still waking up. They'd served together before Jack transferred out of the city after his wife's death. "Got something weird, Paul," Jack had said over the phone. "I'm sending you a photo of a dog. Can you run it through your canine database?" "Breed?" "German Shepherd, about 5 years old. Heavy scar on the rear left leg." Paul grunted. "Give me 30 minutes." Jack clicked off and stared at Ash, who had come in and now sat by the fireplace. Clara trailed behind him, her pink gloves dusted with snow. "Dad," she said softly, "look." She pointed to Ash's leg. Jack knelt. The scar was, more visible today, paler than the rest of the skin, jagged and unmistakable. "What happened to him?" she asked. He traced the line gently. "Training mark. Maybe something worse. Could have been from a shock collar or field injury. Hard to tell." Clara frowned. "Who would hurt him?" Jack didn't answer. Half an hour later, Paul called back. "You're not going to like this," Paul said. "That dog matches the description of canine valor. He went missing 3 months ago during a sting operation outside Billings. Handler was shot. Dog vanished. We assumed he was taken or killed." "Who was the handler?" Jack asked, though his voice was already tight. "Officer Timothy Ruiz. Died in the field. But here's the kicker. Jack, the operation was tracking a cartel branch. They were using off-grid cabins in the backwoods. One of the names floated during the investigation was Ross. No last name. Just a known alias. You said someone with that name came to your door?" "Yeah," Jack said slowly. "He claimed the dog was his." "Then that's not a coincidence." Jack hung up and sat in silence. Ash had been more than a stray. He had been a partner, a survivor. Later that day, the sun dipped low behind the pines, casting long orange shadows over the snow. Jack stood by the window watching Ash pace the backyard. The dog froze suddenly, ears tilted, body taut. A truck passed on the road beyond the fence. Dark gray, with mud-caked tires and a loud, rattling engine. Ash lunged toward the fence, barking fiercely. Jack grabbed his binoculars and zoomed in on the license plate, but it was too muddy to read. Clara, now at his side, asked, "Why is he barking like that?" "He remembers something," Jack replied, "and that truck sounds like something he's heard before." That night, Jack reviewed the footage again. Nothing unusual, but Ash didn't rest. He stalked the hallway, circling the perimeter like he was back on duty. Jack stayed up with him, sitting at the kitchen table, staring at the faded manila folder and the name Canine Valor scrawled on a printed form. He opened his laptop and sent Paul a request. "Can you send me any remaining notes or files tied to the sting operation in Billings, especially regarding a suspect named Ross?" While waiting for a response, Jack stepped into the living room, where Ash finally rested his chin on his paws. Clara had left one of her plush toys beside him, an old bunny with a chewed ear. Ash didn't bite it. He nudged it gently toward her bedroom door. The wind was quiet that night. Snow Ridge sat under a moonlit hush, the clouds having scattered like old thoughts drifting off into the dark. Jack Monroe stood in the hallway outside Clara's room, hand resting against the doorframe. Inside, his daughter was curled beneath a faded quilt, her breath steady and soft, but her cheeks still showed signs of tears that had dried without comfort. Beside her, curled in a silent vigil, was Ash. His back pressed lightly against the side of her bed, his golden eyes open and alert. Jack had never known a dog to listen so closely to grief. Earlier that day, the call from Missoula had confirmed everything. Ash wasn't just a stray. He had been Canine Valor, a decorated service dog trained under Officer Timothy Ruiz, a man Jack had met once in passing years ago at a joint interagency seminar. Ruiz had been quiet but kind, with a dry wit and a stubborn loyalty to his team. The report said he died during a raid, his dog presumed taken or killed. But now, Ash Valor was here, in Jack's house, sleeping beside his daughter, and, technically, not his. That thought had sat in Jack's stomach like cold iron all evening. The law was clear. A canine unit belonged to the department unless officially retired or adopted. And if someone else claimed Ash some agency official, or worse, someone looking to exploit him again, Jack had no legal claim to stop it. Clara had sensed the tension without needing it explained. Over dinner, she'd barely eaten. When Jack tried to mention the possibility of Ash being returned, her fork clattered to the plate and she left the table without a word. Later, he'd found her sitting on the floor of her room, clutching a small drawing to her chest. Now, with the house quiet and the fire dying low, Jack moved toward the kitchen. He poured himself a glass of water and opened the drawer near the pantry where he kept files he hadn't touched in years. It took a few minutes of digging, but eventually he found it, an old seminar packet from the training camp where he and Ruiz had briefly crossed paths. Tucked between faded pages was a group photo officers standing with their canine partners under a banner that read, Statewide Tactical Canine Training, Summer Cohort. In the front row, almost hidden by shadow, was Ruiz, slim, dark-haired, and grinning with quiet pride as he knelt beside a young German shepherd with dark eyes and a slightly oversized right ear. Jack held the photo up to the light. Ash, or rather, Valor. Jack sat at the table for a long time, turning the picture over in his hands. On the back, written in quick, slanted handwriting, were the words, He's more than a partner, he's what gets me home. The next morning, Clara was up early, sitting cross-legged at the dining room table with a handful of colored pencils and a crumpled sketch pad. Jack poured coffee, watching from the doorway. She didn't look up. "What are you drawing?" he asked gently. Clara held it up without speaking. The picture was of 3 figures. A tall man with a badge on his shirt, a girl in a pink dress, and a dog sitting between them. All 3 held hands. Clara had drawn the dog's paw holding Jack's hand and the other paw gently resting in hers. Jack's throat tightened. "Clara," he started, but she cut him off. "You can't let them take him." He knelt beside her. "Sweetheart, he has a name. Valor. He worked with another officer before us. There are rules. But he's here now," she whispered, "and he's mine." Her voice cracked on the last word. That night, Ash followed Clara to her room as usual, but instead of lying near the door, he climbed onto the bed without needing an invitation and rested his head beside her pillow. She buried her face in his neck, and he stayed there without flinching, his body curved protectively around hers. Jack stood in the doorway, watching. That same night, he went to his computer and began drafting a formal letter. He wasn't asking to report Ash. He was requesting to adopt him. The letter was direct, professional, but personal. He included the photo of Ash with Clara, the one he'd taken 2 weeks ago where she'd braided wildflowers into his collar. He wrote about the trauma Clara had carried since her mother died, about how she hadn't slept through the night until Ash arrived, how the dog had not only bonded with her, but sensed things Jack couldn't fear, tension, the danger of what still might be watching them from the woods. He didn't say it in the letter, but he believed it. Ash wasn't just protecting Clara. He was healing her. Snow Ridge sat beneath a brittle moon, wrapped in frost and quiet like the pause before a scream. The wind had picked up again, brushing against rooftops and pine trees like an anxious hand tapping on glass. Inside the Monroe cabin, something felt off. Jack couldn't name it, but it pressed behind his ribs like a stone waiting to drop. Clara had gone to bed early, clutching a book she'd already read 3 times. Ash had settled outside her door, as he always did, head resting on crossed paws. Jack sat in the living room, rereading the adoption request he'd sent 3 days earlier, refreshing his inbox every half hour despite knowing responses didn't come this fast. But something about the silence tonight kept him on edge. By midnight, the house was still except for the occasional groan of the wind. Jack poured himself a cup of weak coffee and passed by Clara's room. He paused. The door was ajar, and the bed was empty. The cup hit the floor and shattered. "Clara?" Ash was already up, sniffing the air, rigid with alarm. Jack rushed outside into the cold, barefoot on the snow-covered porch, scanning the yard. No tracks near the front. He sprinted around to the back. The fence gate was open. Ash growled low and began pacing, nose to the frozen earth. Jack grabbed his coat and flashlight and followed, his breath forming clouds in the air. The flashlight beam wobbled as he jogged after Ash, who had already moved past the tree line. Jack's mind raced. He called dispatch on his radio, voice tight. "This is Sheriff Monroe. I have a child missing. 9-year-old female. Name is Clara Monroe. Possibly abducted from residence, possible connection to previous suspect. Beginning search near Old Creek Trail." He paused. "I'm with the dog." Ash led the way without hesitation, body low to the ground, tail stiff, weaving between trees like a wraith. Snow muffled everything, footsteps, breathing, even the growing panic clawing in Jack's throat. Half a mile in, Ash froze. His ears twitched. Then, without warning, he let out a long, haunting howl. Jack's blood went cold. Ash darted off the trail and Jack followed, slipping on roots hidden beneath snowdrifts. They reached a clearing dotted with the blackened skeletons of what had once been an old hunter's lodge burned down years ago after a lightning storm. But beside the ruins stood something newer, a shack Jack hadn't seen before. It looked hastily built, pieced together from mismatched lumber and salvaged tin sheets. No lights, no smoke, but something about it vibrated wrong in the air. Ash didn't wait. He hurled himself at the door, barking furiously. Jack charged forward, shoulder slamming into the lock. It held. Inside, a muffled whimper. Jack didn't stop to think. He aimed his boot and kicked again. The door splintered open. Ash rushed in. The room was cold, dark, and smelled of gasoline and mold. On the floor, wrapped in a worn blanket, was Clara, shivering but alive. Her wrists were bound loosely with rope. Behind her, a man stood frozen in place, caught between reaching for something under his coat and backing toward the wall. Jack recognized him immediately. Ross. He looked different in the harsh flashlight beam, more desperate. His unshaven face twitched, and there was a raw panic in his eyes. "She followed me," he said hoarsely. "She was playing near the creek. I didn't touch her, I swear." Ash didn't wait. He lunged forward, teeth bared, and sank into Ross's arm just as the man reached for something inside his jacket. Ross screamed, collapsing under the weight of the dog's attack. Jack pulled Clara to his chest, checked her pulse, then turned to see Ash still holding Ross pinned, growling low in his throat. "Let go," Jack ordered softly. Ash obeyed, but not before delivering one last guttural snarl that left Ross whimpering in place. Minutes later, backup arrived. Deputy Luann Rivers, a tough, middle-aged woman with short auburn hair and sharp gray eyes, helped cuff Ross and escorted him out with quiet fury. "You got him," she said to Jack, her breath fogging. "Looks like this nightmare's over." Clara clung to Jack's side, her lips pale but her grip strong. She kept her eyes on Ash, who was now sitting beside the broken door, his flank bloodied where a splintered board had gouged into his side during the scuffle. "You're bleeding," Clara whispered, reaching for him. Ash leaned into her touch. The snow in Snow Ridge had begun to thin, though the cold still clung to the ground like an old memory. In front of the Monroe cabin, small tufts of brown grass poked through, and icicles melted slowly under the weak sun. Inside, life tried to return to normal, though something unseen hummed beneath the surface like breath being held. It had been a week since Clara was found. Ash now walked with a slight limp, his wound stitched and healing, but he remained vigilant. He no longer just followed Clara to her room. He waited until she slept before curling at the foot of her bed, eyes watching the door like a silent promise. Jack sat at the kitchen table, flipping through the mail when he saw the letterhead State Department of Public Safety, K-9 Services Division. He opened it slowly, each fold feeling heavier than it should. The letter was cold, impersonal. K-9 Valor has been identified as a property of the state and is to be surrendered to the nearest qualified agency for reassignment or debriefing. Failure to comply within 7 business days may result in formal action. Jack stared at it for a long time. He had known this was coming, and yet he wasn't ready. He showed it to Clara that night after dinner. She was sitting on the couch in her favorite polka-dot pajamas, her knees pulled to her chest and Ash resting against her side. When Jack read the letter aloud, her face didn't change at first. Just a stillness, like a pause too deep to breathe through. Then she stood, walked to her backpack, and pulled out a lined sheet of notebook paper. She wrote in silence. It wasn't long, just a few sentences. When she finished, she handed it to Jack and said, "Send this too." The letter was written in a shaky, childish scrawl. "He saved me. Now he's home. Please don't take him away. Clara Monroe." Jack folded it neatly and clipped it to the adoption request he'd already submitted. But that wasn't enough. Not for something this personal. The next day, he visited the town clerk's office and filed a formal petition to contest the K-9 unit's claim. The clerk, a rotund man named Albert Reese with bushy white eyebrows and a collection of bolo ties, read the paperwork and blinked slowly. "You're serious about this?" he asked. "Dead serious," Jack replied. Albert scratched his chin. "Well, you won't win it on your own. You'll need voices, witnesses, support." Jack nodded once. "Then I'll find them." By the end of the day, there were already 12 signatures people who'd heard about Clara's rescue, about Ash. By the end of the week, that number tripled. And then came the surprise. Melba Cranston Mell arrived at the sheriff's office wearing her lavender coat and matching lipstick, her hair pinned into its usual beehive. She carried a clipboard under one arm and a thermos of something strong under the other. "I've gathered 76 names," she announced, setting the clipboard down with a dramatic flourish. "And that includes Pastor Glenn, 2 deputies, and the mayor's wife." Jack raised an eyebrow. Even after calling him a flea-bag stray? Mel sniffed. "That was before he risked his life for our Clara. He's not a dog anymore. He's the guardian angel of Snow Ridge." She gave a sharp nod and turned on her heel, muttering about the foolishness of bureaucrats. Jack didn't smile often, but that day he came close. A few days later, a reply came from the K-9 division. Not a form letter this time, but a call. The voice on the other end was quiet, steady. Captain Sandra Halbrook, head of K-9 Services. Jack remembered her from years ago. Tall, poised, former Marine, with a reputation for fairness and no patience for red tape. "Sheriff Monroe," she said, "we received your petition, and the letter from your daughter." Jack didn't speak. "We've reviewed Valor's record. He was presumed dead. The agency has no plans to return him to active service. His injuries and trauma make that impossible. If you're willing to take full legal and financial responsibility, the state is willing to release him into your care, permanently." Jack exhaled. "Thank you. One more thing," Halbrook added. "Tell Clara her letter made it to every desk in this department." When he told Clara that night, she didn't scream or cheer. She simply wrapped her arms around Ash's neck, buried her face in his fur, and whispered, "You get to stay." Ash leaned into her, quiet and steady as ever. Spring came to Snow Ridge not as a sudden bloom, but as a slow undoing of winter's grip. The snow receded in patches, revealing damp earth and sleepy grass beneath. Icicles melted like long-held sorrow, dripping steady into puddles that sparkled in the morning sun. For the first time in months, birds returned to the pine trees, filling the woods with cautious music. At the edge of town, the Monroe cabin looked different. The repairs Jack had put off all winter were finally being done. The porch steps replaced, the window screens patched, and, beside the back door, a new structure was slowly taking shape. It was modest, built from repurposed cedar planks with a small awning and a plaque Clara had hand-painted, Ash's Place. Ash, now fully healed, was stretched out beneath the early sun, his coat glistening with gold highlights where the light struck. Clara sat beside him, barefoot in the warming grass, weaving daisies into a makeshift chain. The air smelled of wet bark and soil of things being born again. She reached into her pocket and pulled out something wrapped in cloth. "Close your eyes," she whispered to Ash. He didn't move, of course, just looked at her with that deep, knowing calm. She giggled. "Okay, fine, you're not good at surprises." From the cloth, she revealed a leather collar dark brown with silver accents, and in the center, a small engraved plate that read, "Ash, our dog." She slipped it gently around his neck. Ash sat up slowly and gave a single huff, leaning forward just enough to press his forehead against her shoulder. She rested her cheek against his fur. "We found each other," she whispered. Inside the house, Jack stood at the fireplace mantel, holding a small photo frame in his hands. It was a picture of Sarah, his late wife, smiling under a summer sky, her arm wrapped around a much younger Clara, both laughing. He set the photo down gently, and beside it placed a folded slip of paper. On it, written in steady, unshaking hand, "I kept my promise. She is loved." He stood there for a moment, the weight of years lifting not all at once, but gently like snow melting off a roof in slow, patient drips. Later that week, the town held its annual spring gathering, an event that felt more needed than usual after the long, hard winter. The square was decorated in pastel banners and paper lanterns, booths lined with pies, quilts, and local honey. Music from a local bluegrass trio echoed down the lanes. At the heart of it all, a small podium had been placed beside the gazebo. Sheriff Jack Monroe, in his crisp uniform, stepped up to speak. Beside him, Ash sat with a silk ribbon tied awkwardly around his neck, clearly confused but tolerant of the attention. Jack cleared his throat. "I don't usually speak much at these things, but today I'd like to say something on behalf of someone who can't speak for himself." There was a quiet chuckle through the crowd. "This dog," Jack said, patting Ash gently, "came into our lives during a storm. He'd lost his way, just like we had. But what he gave us wasn't just protection. It was something quieter. He gave us back our hearts." Clara stood at the edge of the crowd, clutching a bouquet of wildflowers, her eyes shining. Jack smiled, then stepped aside. Mayor Dottie Klein took his place. Dottie was a woman in her 60s with a booming voice and silver-streaked curls, known for wearing outrageously large brooches and giving stirring speeches at the drop of a hat. Today was no different. "On behalf of the town of Snow Ridge," she declared, "we recognize Ash the Shepherd not just as a hero, but as a citizen, a guardian, and, by unanimous vote, as an honorary resident of our community." The crowd applauded. Ash tilted his head, then looked at Clara. She stepped forward, knelt beside him, and whispered something only he could hear. Then she tied a blue ribbon around the leather collar, right under the metal tag. Back at home, long after the celebration, the Monroe house glowed with soft light. The porch swing creaked slowly in the breeze. Clara was asleep, curled up in the armchair, an open book sliding from her fingers. Jack stood in the doorway with a mug of tea, watching Ash settle down in his new shelter outside. The dog turned once in a slow circle, then lay down, head resting on crossed paws, eyes still open as they always were, watching, waiting, protecting, but not just protecting anymore. Belonging. Sometimes miracles don't arrive with thunder or light from the sky. Sometimes they come limping out of a snowstorm. in the shape of a forgotten dog, who heals a grieving child, softens a hardened father, and teaches an entire town what love, loyalty, and redemption truly mean. Ash wasn't just a stray. He was a blessing in disguise. A second chance, sent by the one who never forgets any soul human or animal. Through him, a broken family was restored. A little girl found her voice, and a man remembered how to feel again. Maybe you've been through a long winter of your own. Maybe you've lost something, or someone. But take heart, because healing might be closer than you think. Sometimes, God sends us exactly what we need, wrapped in fur, silence, and loyalty. And just like Clara said, we found each other. If this story touched you, let it touch someone else too. Share it. Comment where you're watching from, and if you believe in second chances and in the God who gives them, comment Amen below. Subscribe for more stories that prove. Miracles are real, and they still walk among us on 4 legs and with hearts full of grace. May God bless you and everyone you love.